Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Ever feel like you're running on a hamster wheel of debt? You are. It's called the American fiat dream. Hoping, praying to get on board the right Ponzi scheme. Get in early. You're set for life. No work, no strife. Too late, and you'll be working late. From today till kingdom come. Yes, sirree, Bob. 1 job, 2 job, 3 job, 4. You'll keep those interest payments flowing to the few winners of the American fiat Ponzi scheme. See?
The Ponzi scheme dream. Well, that one looks like it's falling apart, and it might be shifting over towards China, and that's why I, in fact, brought in this Beijing smog today.
That's really great. Thanks so much. Beijing smog, Ponzi scheming. Ponzi scheme.
So I wanted to just briefly highlight a few things going on in the world as all this Ponzi scheme falls apart.
Ponzi style. Ponzi style.
That's from Seoul.
I've got Soul. I'm Soul brother number 4. There's James Brown, Parliament Funkadelic, Bootsy Collin, Max Keiser. I'm Soul brother number 4.
Well, Canadian wholesale trade sales collapsed. We are also seeing the fastest since 2009.
Canadian?
Canadian.
What's that got to do with China?
No, the American fiat dream, the whole Ponzi scheme of debt that we see across Europe, across Canada, across New
Hockey
Zealand.
Style! Bobby Hull, Bobby Orr, Max Keiser. I'm the 3rd greatest hockey player that ever lived.
Come on. So,
okay, we're in Canada.
House prices in China had their worst decline since Lehman
Now we're
Brothers.
back in China.
Yep. Anti-austerity protesters were setting fire to the ECB this week, and this is the tweet from a journalist from La Stampa, and he says, "This is Frankfurt, the economic and financial heart of the European Union this morning."
Knockburst style. What? Oh, China, Canada, Frankfurt?
Well, our debt scheme is falling apart wherever you look. Greece.
The world? Greece
California.
What?
Latin America, Brazil, London, Hong Kong, everywhere it's all falling apart. You're seeing signs of it ripping apart at the empire of debt.
Is this the debt-apocalypse?
Yes. And that is the image we saw from the ECB Frankfurt this week as people set it alight. Anti-austerity protesters in Germany
they should set it alight in Frankfurt. ECB, Mario Draghi's a
And then the next headline is, it's happening. More U.S. allies join the anti-dollar alliance. After the UK announced it will join the new China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, as a founding member late last week, Germany, France, and Italy decided yesterday to follow Britain's lead and join as well. Welcome to the beginning of the end of the U.S. dollar's domination. It's happening.
Yeah, they got this whole parallel global bank to try to thwart the domination of the U.S. dollar reserves, and the ability for America to do things like cut SWIFT off from Iran, cut SWIFT, which is the global ability to interbank payment system, cut out Russia. You know, this is autocratic rule by a fiat king, which is unacceptable to any country seeking its own sovereignty. I mean, the biggest crime for China, Russia, Iran is that they want their own sovereignty. That's the problem. America doesn't want them to be allowed to have their own sovereignty. They want them to be a vassal state of the Federal Reserve System, and they're saying, man, we don't want to be a vassal state of the Federal Reserve System. Janet Yellen is not who we sing our national anthem to in the morning here in Moscow or Tehran or Peking, as they used to say back in the 80s before they changed it to Beijing.
Even the front page of the Herald Tribune, I saw something like, you know, the Europeans disobey America.
Yeah, right, disobey.
DC by
this is
joining
an amazing bit about this whole Ukrainian adventure and, you know, putting a coup in Ukraine from the U.S. and NATO is that they have forced Germany to side with Russia in this new global bank. That's the unintended consequences. Whoever thought of that in the State Department should be fired.
However, the UK is having one last gasp of a Ponzi scheme push here on this housing, because this is all they have for an economy here in the United Kingdom is housing. Nothing else is produced. That's
Are you talking about George Osborne's flatulent budget 2015 speech?
That's right. And this is why nothing actually is produced here, which is why we had to import Beijing smog, because there's no real smog here, no industry
I see the connection now. It all came around in the end.
Well, you're awfully chatty today.
I feel empowered because I realize we're close to the dollar apocalypse, which means my gold holdings are going to skyrocket finally. Thank you.
So in his 2015 budget, Osborne launches Help to Buy ISA. First-time buyers will get £50 for every £200 they save towards a deposit for their first homes. The new savings account will see the government add £50 to every £200 which savers manage to put away towards a deposit. It will mean that anyone who saves £12,000 towards a deposit will have it topped up by £3,000 by the taxpayer chumps who are not on the housing property ladder. Now, all the headlines agree that this is great for first-time buyers, but the government's going to step in and give you this money. And, however, I noticed that I was thinking that this is great if we could possibly front-run this Ponzi scheme. Well, a lot of people don't think it's a Ponzi scheme. All the people who are going to, get this free money think it's great. But how to front run it, it doesn't actually start until autumn. And in order to get to that £12,000 and to get the £3,000 free lunch from the British taxpayer, it would take 4 years because you can only put £200 a month into the savings account, the BISA, as they call it. Well, there's a thing that happened April 6th, and that is pensioners can cash in their pensions. So from April 6th, they could front run essentially these first-time buyers into the housing market because, of course, they're going to have a huge lump sum to start buying properties.
Ponzi style. Well, look, this new Osborne scheme to ISA-related real estate or property investment is another way to keep the bubble in property extended just a little bit longer. It's another trick. It's another accounting trick. It has nothing to do with savings. If they was concerned about savings, they would allow people to get a return on their savings at the bank. That is, they would raise interest rates. To put a speculative asset like a bubble property in your retirement account is not a savings vehicle. That's a vehicle toward destruction. Now, in terms of opening up your pension account to be invested, as they're going to do in April, that's another huge giveaway to the City of London. Because all these frickin' bankers who are connected to all these brokerage firms are going to get on the phone and contact Mr. and Mrs. British, Shireville, Little Britain, out there in Podunk or Shallopshire, Worcestershire sauce, Marmite swilling Nowheresville near on the Thames, and they'll be like, put all this into this speculative stock and this speculative stock, and they're going to blow them out. They're going to lose all their savings. It's a huge gift. And why? Because they need more fresh cash to go into their massive Ponzi scheme to bail out these banks. This is an absolute horrid idea by Osborne. It's another gift to the city. It's a subsidy. He's got nothing but subsidies to banksters. It's a financial terrorist subsidy. Speech, Budget 2015, Osborne.
I looked back to a headline from just a few weeks ago, and the headline read, "Buy-to-let investors continue to benefit from lending surge, but first-time buyers struggle as loans fall to 21-month low. Lending to first-time buyers fell by 27% in January compared to December. Would-be landlords saw a 5% monthly rise in mortgage advances, and lending to home movers also fell in January, recording a 24% decline." So already with all of those schemes, as we've covered before, that George Osborne has already introduced, taxpayer giveaways, free lunches to certain people willing to be the new chumps on this pyramid scheme, Ponzi scheme that is the housing mortgage market, that they have basically dropped out of the market because they don't have the funds. So now we have this new BISA, which is supposed to convince them to start saving in this account to get the free money to get onto a property ladder in 4 years' time. Well, according to housing experts, they've predicted that the buy-to-let market could attract further interest when pension rules are relaxed next month, allowing people to take money out of their retirement pots instead of being forced to buy an annuity. Pensioners snapping up buy-to-let properties could drive prices higher, making it even more difficult for first-time buyers to get on the housing ladder. So there you see it. It's from April. They're predicting a huge boom in the price of these properties because of the buy-to-letters that are going to come into the market. So this BISA is pointless.
Yeah, it's just an election gimmick. And less than 10% of the GDP of Britain is manufacturing for export, which is a shame because Britain can do excellent manufacturing. I would point your attention to the Rolls-Royce jet engine factory right here in Britain. Those jet engines, they have 70,000 parts each. They're brilliantly conceived and manufactured. They're the standard throughout the world. And it proves that Britain can do manufacturing. They can have a vibrant industry, but they get no help from the government because the government gives all of their subsidies to property speculators, inflating this enormous bubble as a way to bribe votes. And it's a waste. They're wasting a golden opportunity.
But just to be fair, conservative members don't think this is a bribe. They think it's a sound economic policy.
Yeah, well,
Long-term
conservative members
hashtag.
are down there at Dolphin Square getting undressed in front of minors. You know,
Well,
we don't need their opinion, do we?
They think it's hashtag long-term economic plan.
It's long-term debt accumulation. The debt
Exactly.
keeps going higher. If it had made any sense, the debt would go higher, and the taxes would be sufficient to pay down the debt. But the taxes are not sufficient. And as Evan Davis said on Newsnight, BBC last night, kudos to Evan Davis, he had a big freaking chart up there on the screen showing the current account deficit, which is 6% of GDP, which is the largest of any industrialized nation, and growing rapidly because this economy is throwing away all the income-producing assets like Mail, Royal Mail, Eurostar, blowing apart the NHS. All that stuff contributes to a gapping current account deficit.
Well, in
and that's
fact,
the
yeah.
responsibility of this government.
And the government, George Osborne bragged that he was going to sell more assets, and that was going to reduce the debt somehow. But of
Well,
course,
you know, you're selling the cow to buy the milk. And how does that make sense? You frickin' and then of course financial illiteracy is a big part of it. Osborne just whatever HSB tells me to say, that's what I say, but I have no brain because I'm a moron.
Yeah, in fact, you mentioned financial illiteracy. A University of Manchester study found that 60% of Brits don't even know what GDP is.
Starting with Osborne. No, if you sat him down and said, George Osborne, give me a definition of GDP, he couldn't give it to you. You know why? Because that in itself is a nebulous target. If you ask 10 economists for the definition of GDP, you'd get 10 different answers. It changes no matter what country, what year we're in, what cycle we're in. It's completely non-exact definition to begin with. There's no precise definition of GDP for any country at any time.
And the budget, here's an interesting tweet from Stella Creasy, who's an MP, and she said, interesting nugget in OBR's data shows revision of unsecured debt levels due to writing off and reduced consumption, not reduced costs. So that's another thing at the end of the Ponzi scheme. Basically, people are having their debts written down because they can't pay them, or they're reducing their consumption because they can't afford to spend anymore. So that's what the OBR data, the Office for Budget Responsibility data showed. It's not because of cheaper costs, lower interest rates.
Right. The result
QE
of
and all that
Osborne
stuff.
schemes is create poor people. Just like the result of ill-thought-out energy programs of fracking create ecological disaster, Osborne's ill-thought economic policies create poverty. That's the detritus of his financial illiteracy, and poverty in this country is going up because this guy needs to go back to school. We got to go, Stacy. We got to go. We got to go.
Keiser style.
Keiser style. Yep, more when we come back from the 1980s. So stay tuned. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to former Goldman Sachs and Bear Stearns banker Nomi Prinz, author of All the President's Bankers, out in paperback, the 25th of March. Nomi Prinz, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, let's talk about the Cold War. There was the Cold War going back a couple of decades, and now we got the new Cold War. So as you've been writing about, in All the President's Bankers, the research that you were doing for that, a lot of this financial and military institutions that were put in place during the first Cold War are now are in service for the new Cold War. Tell us about it.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories in there that all started after World War II. In the event of the first World Bank, for example, one good connection to what's going on today is that when the World Bank was established, a couple years into it, Harry Truman asked someone who became a banker, John McCloy, who became the head of Chase, but at the time was asked to become the head of the World Bank, the second president of the World Bank. And what he said back then was that the World Bank could be a very useful mechanism for providing Wall Street with bonds to distribute. So what he said to Harry Truman was, I'll be that president, but by the way, I need you to get Wall Street to distribute the bonds, which tied together, which was not the original intent of the World Bank, but it tied together the private banking system with this multinational entity. And that sounds like maybe a little kind of change back at the time in its formation, but what that enabled to occur was for the World Bank, IMF, and so forth, those types of multinational entities to call the shots with respect to U.S. allies in the Cold War, the same allies now in the neo-Cold War, and Wall Street to also call the shots because they would be providing distribution, getting investors for the bonds, for the debt that the World Bank or IMF issued, the aid that they provided to the allies of the U.S. And what they did was they provided help to the bigger allies at better terms and to the smaller allies at worse terms, and of course to the enemies no terms. And that's something that continues to this day. So we had a banker at the helm of that. He then became the head of Chase during the sort of more evolutionary aspects of the Cold War under Eisenhower and so forth. And a lot of what we are seeing today with the fight between the U.S. and Russia, Obama and Putin and so forth, all this sort of manufactured kind of aggression is really still a fight for finances and financial supremacy in the regions, in the areas that the U.S. wants to keep control over relative to what Russia might be associated with. So what we saw back then, which was created as a military financial entity and policy, we just see unfolding today with a lot of the same individuals and entities in different roles along the way as well.
Right. So America, post-World War II empire is based on debt. So I guess what you're saying there is that the Marshall Plan, it was a bond scheme, essentially, that gave a lot of fees. Yeah, a lot of fees and banking fees to Wall Street. And of course, initially, it looked like there was not too much one could challenge on this plan. However, here we are in the year 2015, and the mechanism that's used to distribute financial empire building instruments, those instruments can be turned off. And we're seeing this with Iran. They turned off SWIFT. In other words, and they put that country at a huge disadvantage in the global marketplace. They threatened to cut Russia off from SWIFT, which is the global payment system. And Russia has come back and created their own version of SWIFT. They've also created their own version of the World Bank, right? So this is how this new chapter in the war is taking place, is over financial mechanisms, correct?
Yeah, right. And look at the parallels. The Marshall Plan, rudimentary after World War II. Why was it passed? Why did America and Congress support giving all these billions of dollars of aid to reconstruction of Europe to support the allies of the U.S. at the time, who are not the allies of the other side, of the communist side? I mean, there were articles in Life magazine at the time telling the American people that it was better to provide this public assistance, as it was called, through the Marshall Plan to Europe, rather than befall communism, which could, if it befell Europe, take over the entire world. I mean, this was the kind of stuff that was going about in the mainstream media at the time. And the bankers behind this, again, this was a private-public policy. The bankers behind this, same bankers today, different people, same institutions, were at the forefront of publicly supporting these types of plans, this idea of giving aid, because they came on the back of that aid and provided private aid. And back then, private aid was in the form of loans and investment structures and all sorts of things that were more rudimentary. Today, we have much more technologically advanced financial systems and computer systems and capital markets. So that has evolved. But the premise of effectively giving funds publicly, but from the public coffer, but also augmenting those with private investments, private hot money in and out, speculative activities and so forth at the hands of mostly the larger Wall Street banks, that has continued just in this new evolution. And so when the spigots stop, when speculators come out, when there's some form of wall, whether it's created politically from the side of the U.S. or from outside of the U.S., when there's a wall created, the bankers get annoyed. They find a way around the wall, and these new sets of institutions arise, like what Russia's doing, collaborations between Russia and China and so forth, because they need to figure out ways to finance their interests. So yes, it has emerged into a more complex set of relationships, but what is behind it is this idea that the sort of supremacy of the U.S. is predicated on a political and on a military and a private financial grouping, and that continues to this day, and it started to formulate back then.
As you describe it, over the past couple of decades, the financialization of the global economy really favors Wall Street. They get huge fees based on this. And they've been able to co-opt the central bank. So the Federal Reserve Bank has taken on trillions of Wall Street debt. And the same thing with the Bank of England. And surprisingly, we're seeing it now with the European Central Bank. They've taken on $1 trillion euros in debt. They immediately increased that to $1.5 trillion of quantitative easing or debt purchase. My question is that this was the last major central bank to go rogue and to become part of the U.S. dollar hegemony debt empire. There's no more big central banks left to sign on to this scheme. So the idea that Russia, Iran, China, these are countries that the U.S. would love to extend their financial hegemony into, but it's not happening. So my question is, with the European Central Bank now basically destroying its own balance sheet, is this a race to see who survives this end of an era where financialization ran the world for decades and based on a U.S. dollar world reserve currency? Are we at the end of this era because they've run out of runway? There's no more central banks to leverage in this way. And if that's true, can you talk a little bit about this parabolic move in the U.S. dollar up, what that signifies, if anything, Naomi Prince?
Yeah, the complexity of all of that is this. The central bank quantitative easing that we have seen for going on now 7 years, that has a $4.5 trillion balance sheet from the U.S. Fed, is a multi-trillion-dollar balance sheet growing at the ECB, and with other major central banks signing on for their various methods of quantitative easing, which may or may not incorporate some extra bond buying, but certainly of keeping rates low and keeping the sort of currency rates low relative to the dollar, has enabled the dollar to be propped up only because the dollar had the advantage of first being the global currency, but also the Fed movement in concert with trying to save Wall Street in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, and with both presidential administrations under Bush as he was leaving and certainly under Obama for the years that he has been presiding over the United States, have together collectively decided this was good policy. To basically buy bonds from Wall Street, that is good policy. And somehow they cannot possibly believe it's trickling down to the regular economy. It isn't, but they get to continue to spin as if it is. And so now they transport that to the European side with the ECB. The ECB started a few years ago with their quantitative easing, and now they have recently ratcheted it up with the latest trillion-dollar move in additional quantitative easing to buy effectively bonds from the major European banks. So what began as buying bonds from the major U.S. banks, the Federal Reserve has a $1.7 trillion, for example, mortgage-related security fund bonds that they have bought from the banks that the banks manage. J.P. Morgan manages the Fed's bonds, which came from the major banks. That's now going on in Europe, right? So they're basically buying bonds from Deutsche Bank and from ING and from BNP to give them some sort of solvency. That game of basically putting on debt at the government level, distributing it through the banking systems, buying it back onto the central bank balance sheet. Yeah, that's been going on for multiple years, and that is coming to an end. It isn't at an end. The ECB still has to continue with the bond program that it announced. The markets will get really off as it starts to taper, and that is one of the reasons we're seeing these triple-digit movements in the stock market, and we're seeing a lot of volatility coming into the bond market because there is an end to it. When that end comes, it will diffuse the strength that the U.S. dollar has had on the back of having been the first and biggest promoter of the quantitative easing policy.
Okay, let me jump in for a second. Let me jump in. So as you come to the end of this, and it started with Japan, and then it rolled into the U.S., and now it's in the ECB and the UK, as it comes to an end, and we see this parabolic move in the dollar, which is signifying that it won't work in Europe, because if it was going to work in Europe, people would not be, flying out of Europe as fast as they possibly can. So when it all blows up, and it looks like it's going to blow up this year, 2015, isn't this whole rhetoric by the Obama administration just setting up Russia to take the fall, as if it was their fault that the Federal Reserve Bank and the ECB blew hundreds of trillions of dollars to keep zombie banks alive in a way that's completely irresponsible?
Irresponsible and bad for general populations. Exactly. The U.S. needs an enemy, right? That this whole idea of finding the next place to create more financialization of the markets, more deregulation, more entrance wherever they can. One of the reasons, for example, Obama just became friends with Cuba after having, signed last year the document saying he would not open policy into Cuba from the United States is because they're looking for places to really infiltrate financially, and because of this, ongoing and neo-Cold War with Russia. So that has definitely happened. Russia wouldn't play ball. They wouldn't deregulate and open their markets to the extent, to the policy and to the private banks that the U.S. wanted. And so so the Ukraine became
We're running
sort of
out of time. We have 10 seconds left.
Place.
We have 10 seconds.
Right. So basically what it is the United States is really fighting the next level of the financial political war against Russia to contain, continue supremacy of the financial system from Wall Street as well as the dollar if they can. That's going to come to a head because there's going to be much more on the other side.
America's going to be saved with mojito-backed obligation bonds from Cuba. Well, I feel much better. All right, Nomi Prince, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Nomi Prince. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.